Where can the Buffalo Bills find cap savings, punt god analysis, losing players to the waiver wire, and more is all coming your way today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino from the Draft Network, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Thanks for joining me and making Locked On Bills your first listen every day. And as a reminder, we are free and available to you on all platforms, including YouTube. Well, we're going to get into a bunch of stuff here today on the podcast. I want to start by getting into some contract discussion and looking at this Bills team that has a lot of players left to cut. They got to go from 85 down to 53 here over the next couple of weeks. And I want to talk about some of the contracts that are bubble players where it leads to some interesting conversations about how that could impact some of the decisions that the team makes. Then I want to get into some herd mentality questions. One about Matt Araiza and hang time, Raheem Blackshear, and what the path forward is there. And maybe a little bit of stuff on the defensive line history of Brandon Beane through free agency and some other stuff. So a lot to get to here today on the podcast. Let's get into it, and let's start with some contract discussion. And like I said, I want to mention some of the guys here that have interesting situations that could influence the Bills' decisions when factoring who they're going to keep on the roster. And anytime that I talk contracts, I always get a little nervous because there's a lot of nuance that goes into contract discussions. And so I'm here to tell you that I've checked all of this information with Greg Thompson. And anytime I do anything involving a contract, I do check with Greg because, this is really just a space that he has a lot of knowledge and a lot of comfort and understanding. And so if I don't get Greg on the podcast to talk contracts, I check with him before I do. Now, Greg did tell me that if I said that I checked with Greg and he signed off on everything that I'm about to say being accurate, I also had to say the following, and this comes from Greg. Quote, Greg made me say that some of these releases are credit card spending that would push some dead cap impacts into 2023 that will still be owed by the Bills, even if it's not 2022. All right. So there you go, Greg. All the disclaimers are out of the way. Thanks for the information. Let's talk contracts. Here's what I will also say. The reason that we're having this conversation is because not only are the Bills going to have to make roster decisions, but potentially they need to make roster decisions that will help them get under the salary cap. Brandon Beane has referenced through the media that, right now, based on their projected top 53, might be over the cap. And the way that the cap is figured is it's the top 51 salaries. And so there's a little bit of fluctuation that exists there. And you can look on the internet and you'll see on different websites that the Bills are around $5 million under, but what is that true number? What's the true top 51 going to be? Brandon Beane said they're probably going to have to make moves to be compliant at the start of the season. So what moves can be made to create that cap space? What moves can be created to make sure the Bills can sign players in season? If they want to bring in Odell Beckham or whatever, Joe Hayden, whatever veterans could be out there, they got to have the space to do it. So these are the opportunities to create space. We have two categories of our conversation: restructures and cut candidates. The way that the Bills can create cap space through restructures, there's two players that really make the most sense. And if I'm Brandon Beane, I would fight against doing this. I would want to do this after this season and use these savings for future years where, the Bills are going to be in another tight spot next offseason. So I would hold off, but just so that we're covering it all, the Bills could restructure Trey White's contract and Dion Dawkins' contract. Trey White, a base salary restructure, would result in $6.7 million in cap space savings, and Dion Dawkins would be $4.7 million. So right there, you have that right at your disposal. Now let's talk about cut candidates. And something that in my conversation with Greg this morning before recording this podcast, Greg and I both agree that the Bills aren't going to make decisions for the roster based on finances. They will all be football decisions, and there could be some financial benefits along the way. So just keep that in mind. This is a team that's a Super Bowl contender. You're not over here trying to pinch money if you're not, to save a $1 million if it's not the best move in terms of keeping the best players for your team. Other teams might not be the case, but the Bills aren't one of those teams. So these are bubble players that the Bills could save some money from moving on from. And I'm going to mention some guys here that I have no expectation that the Bills will cut, but their contract lends to some interesting ideas. We'll start with quarterback Case Keenum. I fully expect him to be the QB2. I fully expect Matt Barkley to be waived and signed back to the practice squad. But the Bills, it's worth noting, the Bills could cut Case Keenum and create $3.5 million in savings and also produce no dead cap space at all. Case Keenum's $3.5 million this year is not guaranteed at all. To me, that screams opportunity. Now, you could just play it out. The Bills have done this before with players that had similar situations. Just play it out. That's totally possible. But could you extend him? Maybe you really like Case Keenum. You think for the next 2 years he'd be a good backup quarterback for you. Can you extend him and kind of move some of the money around and potentially help your cap situation this year while also making sure that you have a backup quarterback locked in right now for next season, assuming you like Case Keenum? Just an idea, something that I thought was worth mentioning in this conversation. The next player is Tyler Matakevich, special teams player, a linebacker. The Bills can cut him, and it would result in $2.5 million in cap savings and $750,000 in dead cap. So a decent chunk of change there that you can create by moving on from Tyler Matakevich. Don't think they're going to do it. Not even sure I think they should. Special teams is a meaningful part of the Bills' philosophy, and they have a lot of guys that exist for teams. And Tyler Matakevich, clearly one of the best special teamers, not just on the Bills, but in the league. I think the Bills are pretty comfortable with what they're paying Tyler Matakevich, but it's worth mentioning as a impact position player where there's money potential to be saved. I think he's worth mentioning. Let's talk about O.J. Howard. This is another hot button guy. There's really no incentive for the Bills financially to move on from O.J. Howard. They would save $305,000 against the cap, and they would create $2.6 million in dead cap space. You don't like that at all. You don't want to eat that, especially for a tight end too. That, let's be honest, his primary function is going to be to block. Might get 15 to 30 targets on the season, so maybe he doesn't look like this dynamic, explosive tight end that's going to be a mismatch in the passing game, but he certainly can be a baseline player there and give you above average blocking. That maybe that'll help you digest the lack of impressiveness or, the lack of positive remarks about O.J. Howard as a pass catcher so far through camp. Just keep in mind, there's really no incentive for the Bills to move on from a salary perspective. They would actually have to eat a pretty good chunk of dead cap space. How about wide receiver Jamison Crowder? The Bills could not really gain a whole lot here either. This is a very similar situation to O.J. Howard. You cut Jamison Crowder, it's $110,000 in savings for $1.87 million in dead cap. You're not going to do that from a finances perspective at all. There's no incentive whatsoever. Those are low-cost veterans that the Bills guaranteed a large amount of their salary as somewhat of an indicator that, hey, we plan on keeping you and you making this team. So I would look at O.J. Howard and Jamison Crowder's salaries and contract situations very, very similarly, where you're not really gaining anything. In fact, you're eating a fair amount of money to move on from them. How about Cody Ford? The Bills can release Cody Ford. They'd free up $1.5 million in cap savings. They'd accumulate $869,000 in dead cap. So that's a somewhat reasonable amount of space to create. Obviously, if you think there's some plus value in Cody Ford as a backup and he can fill a couple of different spots for you, maybe tackle in both guard spots. You like his trajectory under Coach Cromer, like all of that's totally possible. And the benefits of moving on aren't that significant. How about offensive lineman David Quessenberry? Don't think he's a cut candidate at all, but the Bills could free up $1.35 million in cap space and accumulate $400,000 in dead cap. So it's a decent contract to get out of if you want to. But I wouldn't be surprised if David Quessenberry is the first offensive lineman off the bench at every spot but center. That's possible to me. So I think he's a very important utility offensive lineman for this team, but worth mentioning here in this conversation. How about this guy, punter Matt Hawk? This is a very obvious situation to me. You would free up $1.1 million in cap space with only $350K in dead cap. You're probably going to do that. Linebacker Andre Smith, this is another interesting one to me. The Bills signed him to an extension to kind of avoid the restricted free agency thing that they were going to have to deal with. And he's a guy that's going to be suspended for the first 6 games of the year. Right now, you can free up $1.1 million in space to only accumulate $125K in dead cap if you move on from Andre Smith. And maybe you like what you have in Joe Giles Harris and Balin Spector and, of course, Terrell Bernard, Tyrell Dotson behind your starters to go with Matakevich. Like, maybe that's something the Bills should really think about. Wide receiver Jake Kumaro, another $1.1 million in savings and only $76,000 in dead cap. So you could free up a little over $1 million by moving on from Jake Kumaro. So maybe that's something to keep in mind as you consider Isaiah Hodgins' chances of beating him out for a roster spot. Last guy that I'll mention because I think he's a hot button player, running back, really special teamer, Taiwan Jones. You save $400,000 in cap space, but you eat $665,000 in dead cap. There's no incentives whatsoever financially for the Bills to move on from Taiwan Jones. So just as some bubble players that I thought had some interesting contract situations that people could be talking about as cut candidates, wanted to put that information out there because I think it's very, very useful. It's almost the start of the NFL season. I love this time of year. And if you're into sports betting or fantasy, you need a competitive edge to win. That's why I highly recommend the Elias Game Plan app. It's the ultimate sports betting and fantasy companion for the NFL, NBA, and MLB. Elias Game Plan is the only sports app from the most trusted name in sports stats, which is, of course, the Elias Sports Bureau, the official statisticians of U.S. pro leagues, including the National Football League. Their app lets you access team and player stats, head-to-head team comparisons, and Elias insights from the Elias Sports Bureau's research team. This app really is your one-stop source for player news and league-validated player stats and team records, expert game analysis for betting, building your fantasy team, and impressing your friends. It's literally the perfect thing for preseason. You get player previews to help you draft a winning fantasy team and team previews so you know what to expect as the regular season kicks off. Take my advice. Download the Elias Game Plan app today, and with new features available all the time, it will help you take your game to the next level. The NFL season is right around the corner, so don't wait. Find Elias Game Plan in the App Store or Play Store today. All right, so a lot more to get into, but I want to get into these topics through herd mentality questions. So I know it's not technically a herd mentality show, but we've been tacking on a few questions at the end of a lot of our podcasts lately, and I want to do the same again today. There's some good stuff. Really like this one here from Ian. It's about Matt Araiza. He says, with concerns on hang time, my question is Matt Araiza's stats from college regarding average return with long punts with poor coverage. Could that settle a little concern, or does it highlight the issue that other teams didn't draft him for that reason? I feel the upside is worth it. Boom it through the end zone or angle it out. Strategic lack of hang time with deep returners. All right, so let's talk about Matt Araiza, the hang time, and what college revealed. And first of all, let me say this. I am happy that I'm getting punter questions, mostly because I felt weird talking about it so much. And I did a Twitter Spaces on Tuesday night for the Draft Network, and I fielded questions from people that came into the Spaces, and I couldn't tell you how many of them were about punters. and Matt Hawk and Matt Araiza. So it's nice to know that this is a hot button issue that's worth talking about. So thanks for reinforcing that with asking this question. So hang time, Matt Araiza, let's talk about it. Matt Araiza punted the football 86 times in college. That's it, 86 career punts in college. His average hang time on those punts was 3.85 seconds, which is insanely low. 3.85 seconds. The lowest in the NFL last year among punters with at least 40 punt attempts was coincidentally Matt Hawk at 4.06 seconds average hang time, and that's terrible. The league average is around 4.25 seconds. So you have a couple of punters here that are not good when it comes to hang time, and Matt Hawk and Matt Araiza. So how did that impact the return opportunity for opponents in college? Again, there's context here. We're talking about the Mountain West. How good are these returners? How good is San Diego State at covering punts? Like, there's a lot of factors here. We're just talking about raw data with no context here. But I think it does tell somewhat of a story. Opponents against Matt Araiza in college averaged a very high number in return yards, 10.5 yards per return. That number, 10.5 yards per return against your fielded and returned punts, would be fourth worst in the NFL last year. The league average is around 8.5 yards per return. Matt Araiza's 10.5 yards per return from college. Now, here's something that's really interesting. Coincidentally, the punter in the NFL last year that allowed the lowest yards per return was, drum roll, Matt Hawk. 5.6 yards per return. The best. Now, I'm sure that stems from a lot of goofy punts. I don't know. I mean, he didn't punt a ton, obviously, but the Bills are very good last year at covering punts and tackling the returner. The next closest, Matt Hawk, number one at 5.6. The next closest is 6.4. He had this by a big chunk. So there's a lot of variables here. Hang time's important. You don't want to, where you really, hang time and outkicking your coverage, like, that's a bad combination. You've heard those things before. You don't want to outkick your coverage, but also have bad hang time. Far line drive punts are a dream for a punt return unit. So that's the concern. And you can see it over 10 yards per return on average for Matt Araiza in college. The hope here is that this guy's just unbelievably talented. You could see that, right? And he's only had 86 career punts, right? This is still new to him. He's developing. But there's just some really different dynamics with Matt Araiza. It's why he wasn't the first punter drafted. There were two guys ahead of him, Jordan Stout and Jake Camardra. Everybody talking punt god, this amazing punter. I even kind of fell into it. I said, look, I think you might have to draft him in the third round. Well, there was some nuance to it that a lot of people overlooked, including myself, where there's just rawness to Matt Araiza. It is what it is. I'm rooting for him. I love him. I got the punt god shirt. Like, don't get me wrong. But there's some interesting conversations to be had here. I think he's going to be the Bills punter. I want him to be the Bills punter. Don't get me wrong, but there's just dynamics here that are very unique when you talk punters. And that's why this guy with all this skill was the third punter drafted last year. All right, let's move on. Next one comes from Rich. This is a good question. Rich says, I'm one of the many enamored with running back Rasheem Blackshear. I just noticed the Bills signed him to a 3-year, $2.5 million deal. I don't know the details, but I assume none is guaranteed, as, like you, I just don't see a path for him onto the roster. Does this contract in any way impact where he ends up? I would think it might, as it reduces the likelihood any team touches him until he clears waivers, and teams are now filling practice squads. He is an automatic practice squad choice for the Bills. How do you think this plays out? Well, I think in a perfect world, the Bills will cut or waive Raheem Blackshear. He'll clear waivers, and the Bills can sign him to their practice squad. I think that's that. If Brandon Beane can push a button right now and guarantee that happens, he would do it. The concern is once you waive the player, and you're going to have to waive all the players you cut, that aren't going to be part of your 53 is you expose them to waivers. And then other teams have the opportunity to claim them and sign them to their active roster before you can put them on your practice squad. They have to go through that process. All the teams have the opportunity to bid on, or you put a claim in, and they would absorb that contract. And if not, they clear waivers and you re-sign them to your practice squad. That's what the hope would be with Blackshear. So every year we do this, right? We talk about players being waived and then signed to other teams, and then you kind of miss out on guys that you wish could stick around. It's a good problem to have when you got a good football team with a lot of depth and a lot of quality veteran depth. That's the world we live in as Bills fans. But I think it is important to just look at history. What has history told us about players Brandon Beane cut and didn't clear and couldn't sign back to the practice squad? These are the players that Brandon Beane cut and other teams signed them to their 53-man roster. And this comes courtesy of Chris Jenke, at Real Chris Jenke on Twitter. He put out a tweet this week about this, and I've been waiting for an opportunity to share it, and I think this is the perfect time because we're going to have these thoughts about Raheem Blackshear. We're going to have these thoughts about Isaiah Hodgins if they Bills wind up wanting to put him on the practice squad. Balin Spector, like insert whatever young player you're excited about, and you're going to be worried that the Bills can get them back to the practice squad. Here's what's really happened so far. These players were signed after Brandon Beane cut them through waivers and were unable to sign them. Here you go. 2018, Ike Bucker, Tanner Vallejo, Adam Redmond, and Kalen Clay. Now, the Bills, the most meaningful player there is Ike Bucker. The Bills eventually got him back. 2019, Ray McLeod, Deion Lacey, Ryan Lewis. 2020, Vincent Taylor. 2021, Nick McLeod, who coincidentally the Bills got back. So that's it. Those are the players that didn't clear waivers. So I guess what that tells me is that you don't have to worry that much. A very low percentage of guys actually get signed to an active roster because that's kind of the caveat. You have to sign them to your active roster. You don't sign them to the practice squad. You got to put them on your 53. It's a big choice for teams to make, considering, they've never had this guy around, most likely. And I say this, I mean this very kindly, but like we're dialed in on the Bills, right? We know the Raheem Blackshear for the Bills, but I'm guessing that guy exists for a lot of teams, right? There's players just like that for other teams where fans of them are like, oh boy, hope we can get him back on the practice squad, right? It usually works out. And at the end of the day, like let's say that the Bills, they expose Raheem Blackshear to waivers and some team signs him to their 53-man roster. I'm excited about him as an RB4 and a special teamer and all that stuff, but does it change your expectations for the season? You should be able to find quality RB4s that can help you on special teams any year. So good problems to have, but I don't want to fret too much on this type of stuff. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information. From live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts, they have you covered. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening now. It's BetOnline. It's where the game starts. We're talking hang time and RB4s. I love it, man. I love this. That's what Bills Mafia demands. If I covered some other team, which I wouldn't because I think I could have success with this because I love this team so much and I like talking about them and it just comes natural and I'm dialed in, obviously, throughout the history of this team. But Bills Mafia is the fan base out there that wants to talk about hang time and RB4s and how to get them back through the practice squad. Love that. All right, I got 3 more questions to get to. Next one comes from Rod. Rod says, we don't have a great track record with free agent defensive linemen, i.e. Trent Murphy, Vernon Butler, F.A. Obata, and Quentin Jefferson. Why should Jones, Settle, Phillips, and Lawson be any different? Hate to get my hopes up again. Also, now that Poyer may get a long-term deal, when do you think we will turn off the cash so we don't mortgage the future? I always heard we can't sign everyone to long-term deals. Are we to believe that Edmonds, Oliver, Knox, and Davis will all be retained also? What happened to the salary cap hell? Good questions here, Rod. Let's start with the defensive linemen. You mentioned 4 guys, Trent Murphy, Vernon Butler, F.A. Obata, and Quentin Jefferson. Well, Trent Murphy was coming back from an ACL tear, and he never came back from it fully, and he was a disappointment, but I think the injury there is worth mentioning. Vernon Butler has always stunk. That was a bad deal. And what did you see? He got cut by the Raiders. He was one of the first 5 cuts for the Raiders, and that team needs defensive tackles. The guy just thinks out loud. F.A. Obata, I thought was a good player for the Bills last year. I thought that was a perfectly fine addition. And then Quentin Jefferson, who was a good player for the Raiders last year, the Bills played him out of position. They asked a penetration style 3 technique to play 1 tech. So I don't know that that was necessarily a whiff. So I think there's some context there that's important to keep in mind if you're going to reference those players and say the Bills haven't had a great track record with free agent defensive linemen. I like this group of free agent defensive linemen. I really do. Von Miller, why didn't you include him? That was a free agent signing. Von Miller, Tim Settle, Daquan Jones, like Daquan. I know exactly what Daquan's going to be. Tim Settle has just flashed after flash. I'm excited. We know what Jordan Phillips is. And Shaq Lawson, like, they signed him to like a minimum type deal. There's no real like gamble there. So I hear you, but I also think there's some really important context. As for the whole, how do the Bills keep retaining everyone? Well, first thing that I want to say is the Bills have lost players in free agency, starters. The Bills have had to cut players to create cap space. And the reality is Brandon Beane just has done a great job of managing this roster. He's let go of the right players. And so we haven't necessarily felt these losses. Players that left in free agency, Jordan Phillips and Shaq Lawson, that happened, right? They both signed $10 million a year $10 million a year salaries at other places. And now they've come back for way less than that. Those were important players for the Bills. They didn't bring them back. They couldn't bring those guys back. Levi Wallace, they let him go. Harrison Phillips, let him go. Jerry Hughes, Mario Addison, like those guys, their contracts went up and the Bills didn't bring them back, and they were all starters, important players. They just chose to go with different ones. They've had to cut John Brown, who was an important player for this team. John Feliciano, Cole Beasley, Darrell Williams, starter. They cut A.J. Klein. Like, they've done these things. It's just, it's worked out. So when you say they've been able to keep everyone, they haven't. Just Brandon Beane's done a good job of letting the right players go so you don't really feel it, but it has happened. Now, Edmonds, Oliver, Knox, Davis, I mean, that's a ton of money. I mean, you're talking big dollars for all of those guys. You're going to have to do those restructures. You're going to have to restructure Trey White. You're going to have to restructure Deion Dawkins. You're going to have to restructure Josh Allen. You're going to have to hope the cap goes up. There's definitely some challenges here, but when 17 is your quarterback, you just kind of figure it out, right? That's the reality of it. So I hear you, but Brandon Beane has just continued to figure it out. I've said this a lot. The Bills entered this offseason, and we were sitting there. I was guilty of this. Last year's team was the best they'll ever have around Josh Allen. You blew it. You missed your opportunity. They entered the offseason over the cap, picking late in every round of the draft. This team, I don't think you'll find a single person in the world that would disagree that this is the better team on paper than what Josh Allen had around him last year. So Brandon Beane, until he doesn't figure it out, I'm going to assume that he can. Tony says, I've been wondering for a while and haven't been able to get an answer. Does a fullback count as a tight end or running back when talking about personnel groupings on offense? Good question. Love this question. They would count as a running back. So remember, when we talk about personnel groupings, 10, 11, 12, 20, 21, 22, whatever personnel groupings, the first number is the running back. The tight end is the second number. So the fullback would go in the running back column. So if it's 11 personnel, that's one running back, one tight end. 12 personnel, one running back, two tight ends. 21 personnel, two running backs, one tight end. 20 personnel, two running backs, zero tight ends. So fullbacks fall into that first number under the running back category. Last one comes from Zach, who says, on WGR, they are always discussing the punt returner duties and who will get them. My thing is, if Micah Hyde has shown he can do it and seems to be the safety blanket for it in the playoffs, why would they keep a roster spot for someone instead of giving that to him full time? I understand they don't want him to get hurt, but isn't it a wasted spot on the roster if they keep a guy just for that? Listen, I hear what you're saying here, but the Bills aren't keeping anybody on the roster only because they can punt return. That's not the case. I think the Bills punt returner this year is going to be Khalil Shakir, who's also a meaningful developmental receiver that could catch some balls this year. Who else could it be? Isaiah McKenzie, that's another receiver. So the Bills don't have a bad punt returner that they're just rostering because they can return punts. That's not the case. So it wouldn't be a wasted roster spot because it's something that they do. It's not the only thing that they do. And I think you would want to avoid Micah Hyde having to, outside of it being a pinch situation, him being the guy back there. You want somebody else that you can trust that's not, an elite caliber all-pro safety. So if the Bills rostered a bad punt returner just to be a punt returner, like, I would totally get what you're saying, but that's just not going to be the case. All right, folks, tomorrow is going to be a good one. It's not finalized yet, so I don't want to say it, but if it comes together, you're not going to want to miss tomorrow's podcast. It's going to be a really, really good discussion. So make sure that you're subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. And I do look forward to talking with you again tomorrow.